Good morning. Thank you very much for that introduction. I'll probably wander around a bit. I was hoping I would have a pointer so I could point to my slides because there's lots of data on them, but I'll just have to explain as best I can. What I'm going to try and do today is give you a very short, very brief overview of the global hardwood market. I've only got 40 minutes or so, so it's going to have to be very brief. It's very much a top-level overview. I'll cover quite a lot of ground. Hopefully in the questions and answers we can have a bit of a discussion about some of the things that are shown on these slides. Let's just start. This is the global trade in hardwood products over the last 15 years or so, between the years 2004 and the year 2017. It's shown in US dollar value, constant value, so it has been adjusted for inflation. And the data is drawn from both export data in blue and from import data in brown. And what's exciting to me as somebody who looks at this data a lot is actually the data is pretty similar. It's almost exactly the same. And that means the quality of the data is certainly improving. Another thing to point out about this chart is that it's pretty flat over the last 15 years or so, the trade value, which is fairly disappointing when you're considering over the last 15 years or so, the world population has grown by about a billion. Something like 1.4 billion people have been brought out of poverty over that same period, and yet the global hardwood trade value has remained fairly flat. So that raises some issues about really, are we getting sufficient value out of this trade internationally? Yes, the data I showed you there, of course, was in US dollars. Another thing we have to take account of is the fact that the US dollar value has been tremendously strong, particularly over the last 6 or 7 years. This chart shows how the value of the US dollar has changed, the value of various global currencies has changed against the US dollar over the last 15 years. And most of them, of course, have weakened, and some of them have weakened quite significantly. The few that have not, the Chinese currency, for example, the Vietnamese currency, these are managed currencies. They are pegged quite closely to the US dollar. They haven't declined to a significant extent. But most other currencies have, the British pound, the Eurozone, the euro, the Canadian dollar, of course, down about 20% still against the US dollar from 5 or 6 years ago. The Japanese yen was a managed decline of about 30% against the US dollar over a period of a couple of years in 2014 and 2015. And then right at the bottom is the Russian ruble, which is still about 50% of the value of the US dollar, what it was about 5 or 6 years ago. There's another currency I haven't shown on there, which is quite important if you're in the European hardwood industry, is the Ukrainian currency, which has dropped 70% against the US dollar over the last 6 or 7 years. It's important in Europe because if you look at the European trade, there's a lot more imports now from Russia and from Ukraine into Europe. And products like American hardwood have become relatively less competitive in the European market and in global markets generally. The relatively high value of the Chinese currency is very relevant here. The Chinese market, which was previously, a lot of the wood previously going into China was re-exported. Now that is becoming much larger consumption market for hardwood products. The same with Vietnam. But China is less competitive internationally in exporting hardwood products than it was only a few years ago. And most of the hardwood going into China is now used in the domestic market. But I will show some figures just to follow that up in the next 20 minutes or so. So it has these currency exchange rates. They had a very big impact on the global hardwood trade over the last 5 or 6 years. Generally, anything denominated in US dollars has generally become less competitive internationally. These other hardwoods like European oak, like Ukrainian oak, have generally become more competitive based on exchange rates only. Now, of course, I'm going to give you sort of broad aggregate data on how the hardwood industry, how the trade has changed. But underlying that, there have been some huge changes in the species that make up international trade. This is a very subjective view of how species fashions, how species supplies have changed, but I think it's reasonably accurate. It's my own view of how things have moved over the last 15 years or so. Until about 15 years ago, some of these species in the top band, species like rosewood, mearbow, ramin, Burmese teak, Aframosia, American hardwood, American mahogany, and Mongolian oak, these constituted a very large part of the international hardwood trade until fairly recently. However, a lot of these species in that top band are now critically endangered. They're actually listed on the CITES on endangered, the CITES list of endangered species internationally. So they're now controlled through the CITES listing process. They're not allowed to be exported in any volumes. There are quotas imposed upon them. Species like Mongolian ash, Mongolian oak, these supplied China large quantities until only about 5 or 6 years ago, but there's barely any of this resource left. There's another band of species there which I've listed commercially limited. There are some perhaps quite surprising species on there. For example, European oak, that's no way endangered in terms of there's no threat to that species. There's a huge resource of European oak across Europe and across parts of Russia, but it has become very commercially restricted, and that's because there's been such a strong focus, a fashion focus on European oak in recent years. Same sort of thing could be said about red alder, walnut. These are quite abundant species, but there are limitations on how much can be supplied into the marketplace now. Other species like lesser-known Amazonian species, these are actually being promoted by organizations like the Forest Stewardship Council as alternatives to some of the species in the higher band, but they are commercially restricted. And if you look at the species now that have most growth potential, certainly in Asia, Oceania, Africa, and in Latin America, most of the growth potential in those areas now is in plantation species. Species like, certainly in China, they have this huge area of poplar plantation, which they're trying to they're trying to improve utilization of. A lot of these woods are only available in very small dimension logs, so they're having to develop more efficient processing sectors that can process these small dimension logs. But North America, of course, is fairly unique in the sense that it still has a large number of natural forest timbers which are in abundance and which are, in many senses, they're underutilized. Their use could be greatly expanded the world over. The US hardwood resource, for example, has doubled in volume over the last 50 years. It's a tremendous natural resource. This is where a lot of the future growth of trade in hardwoods will be. It will be, I think, in North American hardwoods internationally. So this chart now breaks down that first chart, the one which was relatively flat. It breaks it down into its component parts. That chart was made up of 5 different product groups: logs, sawnwood, moldings and decking, veneer and plywood. And what you see here is there's tremendous volatility in the global trade in logs, sawnwood and in plywood. There was a huge dip between 2000 and 2008, which of course would surprise no one. That was driven, of course, by the financial crisis. Then there was a very quick rise after the financial crisis, and this is where the trade in hardwoods transferred very much from the Western world towards emerging markets, particularly China. And it grew to a considerable height in 2014, reached a peak, and it has fallen back a little bit since then. I'll explain the reasons for that in a minute. Veneer and moldings, the trade there has been rather different. It's been fairly flat or declining. The global trade in hardwood moldings and decking, driven mainly by 2 countries, Indonesia and Brazil. The availability of those products from those countries has been declining, so there has been quite a slow decline. Veneer, I'm not going to say a lot more about veneer. It's a very specialized market. Just to say at a global level, the value has been, again, slipping quite slowly. And to a large extent, The trends in those two product groups are driven by substitution. There's a lot of substitution of veneers and of decking by other material sectors. What I'm going to focus on now over the next 20 minutes or so is the sawnwood market and the logs market. I haven't really got time to cover all the other sectors. The plywood sector is an important sector. I'm not going to talk in detail about that. All I would say is that over the last 15 years or so, there has been a big structural change in that particular sector. China now accounts for something like 70% of the plywood that is produced globally, and it accounts for about 40% of world exports. So that sector is very much now increasingly dominated by China. And that, of course, has led to all sorts of political issues, anti-dumping measures and that sort of thing being imposed in the United States on Chinese plywood. So that is a very big, important sector, but I'm not going to talk in detail about that. I'm going to talk first about the hardwood log trade, the global hardwood log trade. How has that changed over the last 15 years? Well, this shows production of hardwood logs actually over the last 5 years in this instance. And I was actually, when I looked at these figures, I was actually quite surprised by it. These figures come from FAO, so their accuracy is a little bit dubious. A lot of countries don't really report very accurately to FAO what their production of logs is. However, it gives you some idea. I would have expected China's log production to be lower than that, to be honest, because they have, over the years, they have been implementing controls on natural log harvests in China. And in fact, at the end of last year, they did implement a total ban on any extraction of natural hardwood forest logs at the end of last year. So I would expect from next year the production in China to decline, its hardwood log production to decline quite dramatically. Those figures also do include, though, this small dimension, smaller logs that are now coming out of popular industrial plantations. So again, that production will probably rise, but quite slowly over the next few years. Southeast Asia, a lot of that production there is now plantation wood. It's species like acacia. That also includes rubber wood, plantation teak. A lot of the products there are these smaller dimension logs now coming out of these often quite fragmented plantation estates in Southeast Asia. And then we've got North America, where we have seen over the last 6 years, we have seen a slow rise in production. It did decline a little bit in 2015. I think it declined a little bit, but it has been rising again since in the last couple of years. Again, driven by the rise and improvement in consumption, particularly in the United States, and also by the big rise in exports from the United States particularly into China. Other parts of the world, India, yeah, the figures there are very, very poor. But in India, something like 75% of log production in India is from small industrial, small non-industrial plantations. Only a very small amount is natural forest timber. And India, most of that, of course, is consumed domestically now. Europe has been pretty flat in terms of production, and Russia, CIS regions, a slight increase. And Africa has been rising, again, driven mainly by log exports to China. This shows how the global hardwood trade has changed by the major import region. This is over the last 15 years or so. And what you see there is, of course, the role of China has been actually quite profound. The imports by China rose to a huge height in 2014. This was the log imports. This was driven very much by a speculative boom in rosewood imports, a very valuable redwood species that the Chinese use for their traditional furniture manufacturing. There was a huge speculative boom in exploitation of rosewood coming from countries in the Mekong region, particularly also another species of rosewood coming from Africa. That boom ended very quickly, very sharply. In fact, at the point that rosewood was listed on the CITES, the Convention on International Trade in Endangered Species, it was listed in 2015 on that convention. So now trade in that species is much more tightly controlled. And actually after that, the volume of trade in rosewood into China has declined quite sharply. India, until a couple of years ago, was a very large expanding market for hardwood logs. It was getting all these teak logs, particularly from India, from Myanmar, from Burma. But of course, the Burmese also banned the export of teak logs in 2014, after a lot of their forests had been overexploited for a very long period of time. The teak log resource in Burma is very badly diminished now. And since that date, since the log export ban was imposed in Burma, Indian log exports have declined quite sharply. The other country I just emphasize here, just point out, is the purple line. Vietnam is just beginning now to import more logs, particularly temperate hardwood logs, for example, from North America and Europe, a bit like China. Now, this is just focusing, next few slides, I think they focus very much on China's hardwood log imports. They come very much from the Pacific region as the main supply region of hardwood logs into China. The Pacific region here being mainly Papua New Guinea and the Solomon Islands. In fact, these countries are basically exploiting logs and just selling them the whole volume into China. That's their business model at the moment. They exploit the logs, sell them all into China. African log exports have been rising very rapidly into China over the last 6 or 7 years. Again, this was initially driven by the rosewood boom, but more recently there is an expansion of a wide range of hardwood logs going into China from Africa. CIS, again, mainly from Russia. The exports from Russia, mainly of birch logs, are increasing rapidly into China at the present time. Also, Europe and North America. And of course, this is a very big political issue now in Europe and North America, the expansion of log exports into China. In terms of China's overall supply, they are a relatively small component of China's overall imports of logs. But it's been sufficiently large, it has grown sufficiently rapidly for this to become quite a big political issue in both Europe and North America. I think we'll probably hear a little bit more about that later on. The Mekong region, that was the main source of rosewood logs into China, and that did spike in 2014. Yeah, just to show you, this is what happened in India. It was quite an interesting situation in India. It was a big log import market until 2015. But with the removal of Myanmar, Burma from the supply base, and also a big decline in availability of logs from Malaysia, particularly from Sarawak, India has not been able to replace its imports of logs with products from other regions. So as a result of that, there is a big supply deficit in India. So at last, we are beginning to see India importing a wider range of products, including some sawn timber, which simply to fill the huge wood supply deficit that has opened up there. Now, just moving on to talk about the sawn hardwood trade globally. This shows the sawn hardwood production by global region. Again, China features very strongly, producing a large rise in sawn hardwood production over the last 5 or 6 years. Again, that's driven both by the increased utilization of industrial plantations of poplar, and also, of course, the conversion of logs which are imported into China. North America is the second largest producer of sawn hardwood. Again, this is where we saw quite a sharp rise until 2015. It dipped in 2016, but I'm fairly certain sawn hardwood production increased again a little bit in North America in 2017. Elsewhere, though, the notable feature about all the other regions is that production has remained fairly flat and consistent. There isn't a lot of opportunity there to see an increase in production in the other regions of the world. So what the challenge to them is to get a greater amount of value, to create more value from the same hardwood log production. This just breaks down sawn hardwood trade over the last 15 years into its temperate and tropical constituents. Again, not a big change there. Both tropical and temperate have followed the same sort of pattern. In fact, quite surprising again, there's been a slight increase in the share of value of tropical compared to temperate in the global trade. And again, that is driven entirely by China, which is buying in a lot of tropical sawn timber these days. Just looking at the major temperate sawn hardwood exporters last year, and the message there is very, very clear. The US is by far the largest exporter of temperate sawn hardwood in the world, and that volume is increasing. It increased to a first peak in 2014, dipped again in 2015, and since then has risen again to the highest level ever last year, to about a value of about $2.5 billion last year in US sawn hardwood exports. Elsewhere, there's not a huge amount of action. It's fairly flat exports from other parts of the world. Croatia's increased a little bit. Croatia was a major supplier, is a major supplier of good quality oak into the European market, but that supply base is quite small, and there's not a lot of opportunity to expand that. Canada there, of course, production looks fairly flat over the last 4 or 5 years. And then, yeah, the other producers are mainly European: Belgium, Russia, France, Romania. Big downward trend in Romania. Romania actually is the largest European hardwood producer, mainly of beech, and there has been quite a big decline in Romanian production over the last 4 or 5 years, partly due to policy problems with the large state-owned forests in Romania. Yeah, this shows how US consumption of sawn hardwood has changed over the last last decade or so. It shows how the mix of consumption has changed quite radically within the United States itself. It's pretty obvious what's happened here. There has been a fairly consistent demand for industrial products, pallet lumber, cants, board road mats, and ties. That's remained relatively consistent over the long term. However, meanwhile, the grade lumber market in the United States has declined very, very sharply over that period. And of course, that's driven to a large extent by the shift of the furniture manufacturing sector to China, and also the substitution of hardwood in various applications in millwork, cabinets, and to some extent flooring. This is showing that same data in a slightly different way. It's showing how US sawn hardwood consumption has changed by individual sector. And again, it highlights that pallets, of course, are the large industrial user of hardwoods in the United States. There's been quite a sharp decline over the last couple of years in pallet consumption in the United States, mainly because of increasing use of softwood, substitution of the hardwood for softwoods. Elsewhere, though, there has been a slight decline in demand for railway ties in the United States over the last couple of years. Flooring demand is picking up a little bit, as far as I understand. Cabinets and millwork. Cabinets is rising a bit, and the furniture demand has been declining a little bit, the consumption in those sectors. But the important point here is the dotted red line. A lot of the domestic market for grade lumber has been replaced by exports. Much more is now being exported from the United States. And the result of that, of course, the export market now is much more important in driving prices for US hardwoods. I think this slide shows it very well, which I'm very grateful to the American Hardwood Export Council, drawing on data from the Hardwood Weekly Review for this particular slide. It shows that until about 2009, housing starts in the US were the major driver of American hardwood prices. But since that period, those two trends have become decoupled to a large extent. Now prices are no longer driven by the domestic housing starts in the United States. They're much more closely driven now by exports. And I think that chart shows it very clearly. There's a very close correlation now between the level of export and the price of American hardwoods, particularly red oak, of course. And what's driving those exports? Well, of course, again, we come back to the major export market for US hardwoods is, of course, China. And it has seen a huge growth in exports to China from 1.5 million meters cubed to close to 2.5 million meters cubed last year. The United States exports of sawn lumber to China. Exports to other countries in North America, particularly, of course, Canada, have remained fairly stable. Other regions, in fact, it's been fairly flat to other regions. And without the growth in China, exports of US hardwood lumber would probably have, well, they would have been static or even slightly declining over the last decade or so. So China now is increasingly dominant in US hardwood exports. This breaks down the species that were exported last year by the United States to each individual global region. It does highlight that about 6 or 7 species dominate in the mix in exports. Red oak, tulip wood, white oak, ash, red alder, and walnut are particularly prevalent, to some extent cherry. The other species like maple, hickory, birch, and other temperate hardwoods, non-differentiated other temperate hardwoods, they're important in North American trade, of course, between Canada and the US, and Canada and the US and Mexico, but they're less important in global exports. China is taking mainly red oak, but also has been taking a larger amount of yellow poplar, tulip wood as it's identified here, and white oak and ash in recent years. Southeast Asia is increasingly taking lots of tulip wood, yellow poplar. That again is a feature of the furniture sector. They're using a lot more tulip wood for furniture manufacturing, and also white oak. Europe has always been dominated by white oak. That's a trend that continues, although there's also been quite a large increase in imports of tulip wood from the United States, again, to supply cabinets and the furniture sector. Amica is the Africa, Middle East, Central Asia region. Again, it takes, similar to China, it takes a lot of red oak, but also huge amounts of ash. That's where a lot of the ash is going, is to that particular region. Oceania, Australia, incidentally, is almost all a white oak market. But these trends, to a large extent, there has been some increase and expansion in the range of exported species. Certainly, tulip wood has been an increasing part of US exports, particularly over the last 5 or 10 years. This slide here, which many of you probably have seen already, but it's one that Mike Snow of the American Hardwood Export Council shows quite regularly. It comes from a Hardwood Market Report executive. And again, it highlights how the drivers of US hardwood demand exports have changed quite dramatically over the last 15 years or so. In the period 1999 to 2006, there was, of course, that big shift in US furniture manufacturing out of the US into China, and also a US domestic housing boom. And at that time, a lot of the wood exported from the United States was re-exported in furniture back into the United States. Then there was the bust between 2007, 2009, and then since 2009, there has been this huge increase in US hardwood lumber exports, driven mainly and increasingly by domestic demand in China, the growing middle and upper classes in China using it for all sorts of interiors, for their furniture, for their own furniture consumption. And last year, in fact, this slide stops in 2016. In 2017, the exports of US hardwood lumber to China increased by about another 15% or so. So this trend certainly has some way to go yet. Yeah, this shows how the consumption of US hardwood exports to China have changed again over the last 15 years or so. Back in 2000, again, this data comes from AHEC, working with the China Timber Importing Association. That has shown that back in the year 2000, about 85% of US hardwood lumber that was exported into China was re-exported. It was for re-export as furniture, a lot of it coming back into the United States. In 2016, though, that position is completely reversed. About 80% of US hardwood lumber that's exported into the country now stays in China. So a big structural change in the usage of sawn hardwood exported to China. But of course, North America, the US, is not the only supplier of hardwoods into China. There are a lot of other suppliers, and in fact, the largest supply region into China of sawn hardwood in recent years has been the Mekong region, by which we mean Thailand, Burma, Cambodia, and Laos. Those countries have been a major source of sawn hardwood into China in the last 6 or 7 years, and it has been increasing to quite remarkable numbers over the last 6 or 7 years. A lot of that is low-quality industrial sawn wood for products like pallets and packaging, and a lot of it is rubber wood, I think. A lot of it comes from farming plantations, rubber wood plantations, acacia for furniture. But in the mix is also quite a bit of rosewood, although that has been restricted under the CITES regulation, although probably quite a lot still goes in to China. Other than Mekong region, North America, exports from Southeast Asia into China have been generally declining, and this is partly because Malaysia, the big supplier of sawn hardwood in the Southeast Asian region, is now shifting a lot more of exports towards higher value products. It's using a lot more of its sawn hardwood for domestic furniture manufacturing, and also because it has been restricting supply from its own natural forests over the last decade or so. Africa is gradually increasing its supply of sawn hardwood into China, but the other big trend is Russia. Again, partly because they're now restricting log exports from Russia, so there has been, to some extent, a shift towards sawn wood exports from Russia into China in the last 5 or 6 years. And Europe is also increasingly exporting a lot of European oak and beech as sawn lumber into China. Again, this is just looking more broadly at the main tropical suppliers into the global markets, which are the main tropical suppliers of sawn hardwood into global markets in the last 6 or 7 years. Well, again, Thailand features very strongly. Again, this often surprises people. Why is Thailand such a large exporter of sawn hardwood? But again, a lot of this is rubber wood. It is plantation wood. It's low quality, going mainly, almost exclusively, in fact, into China. Malaysia is not exporting any more sawn hardwood. It's been pretty flat over the last 5 or 6 years, again, because of this transference of product to more domestic value-added industries. The other data, yes, Cameroon, a very large supplier of particularly products like of sapele, good quality African mahogany type species, going both into North America and also into Europe. It's becoming less reliable as a supplier of sawn hardwood just at the present time. There's a lot of logistical problems at the port, the main port of Douala in Cameroon. In fact, this is a problem which led to the recent announcement that Rougier, one of the few remaining large European companies in operational Africa, is having quite severe financial difficulties because of the problems in the port of Douala, and also because of the Cameroon government hasn't been able to pay its VAT refunds over the last few years. So a lot of problems in a lot of supply problems in getting hold of African sawn timbers, a lot of issues with logistics. These problems haven't really changed, and obviously there's also been quite a lot of heavy overexploitation in some of those African countries over the years. So the availability of the top quality hardwoods is not what it was only a decade or so ago. Yeah, Cambodia, and Laos are there. Laos was a huge exporter of rosewood, very much engaged in that speculative boom for rosewood until a couple of years ago. That's why the figures there are so volatile from Laos. And then just looking at the next 10 largest on the import side, which other countries are importing sawn hardwood globally. All of these countries, incidentally, are minnows compared to China. I think the second largest importer of sawn hardwood in the world is now Vietnam, but that amount there of about that's about 0.5, yes, $500 million of sawn hardwood imported into Vietnam last year. That's only one-tenth of what China imported last year. So even the second largest importer of sawn hardwood globally is a very small market compared to China. Again, there's not a lot of growth in imports in any of those other markets. In fact, typically, most of them are declining in terms of imports. So if we weren't looking at China, we'd be saying that actually the hardwood trade is pretty much is declining in most other countries. To a large extent, that is supply-driven. A lot of other countries clearly aren't in a position to compete for this material with the Chinese and are looking to use other materials, other types of wood. I just want to say briefly something about I've got 5 minutes, okay. So I'll say briefly something about the European hardwood market. It's something that's quite close to my heart. It's something I've been working with for a long time. Again, the production in this market has been fairly flat over the last 5 or 6 years. Been no real change there. The big feature now of the European hardwood market is that it's so focused on domestic production. It consumes about 80% of production of hardwoods in Europe is domestically produced. There's not a lot of imports from outside now. The market's been fairly static. Construction sector growth has been fairly slow. And there is this very, very heavy focus in this market on European oak, which I think is particularly well illustrated by this slide, this changing trend in usage of species by the European hardwood flooring sector, which now about 80% of all flooring produced in Europe is now manufactured from European oak. A big problem in Europe, which is just emerging, is supply. Supply of European oak is now very short. Croatia, which was a major exporter of logs to other parts of Europe, recently implemented a 2-year ban on exports of oak logs and green lumber, ostensibly for phytosanitary reasons, although there's a suspicion that probably had a lot to do with domestic pressure of the industry domestically with trying to maintain their own supply of logs. And the hardwood sector in Europe, its number of operational hardwood mills has declined about 30% in the last decade. So a lot of problems in the domestic European hardwood sector. The import side has been very little growth. It declined very sharply, of course, in the financial crisis, and there has been very, very little growth in that market in terms of imports from other parts of the world. What growth there has been primarily from Ukraine and Cameroon in 2016, although that has now diminished again. But it is interesting to look at Europe, mainly because it is a center, a source of innovation in the development of new products, new capacity, where there are potentially some quite significant new opportunities to develop markets for hardwoods of all types, but particularly temperate hardwoods. We have seen this trend in the last 10 years, this great interest in building high timber towers using cross-laminated timber. And we have seen this rise in the number of stories of buildings. The most recent in 2018, well, this year is going to be a 22-story CLT tower, which is going to be built and finished in Amsterdam this year. So we have seen this growing interest in CLT construction internationally. A lot of the CLT production is concentrated in Europe, where we have, this year it looks like production will increase to about 1 million cubic meters. But what we're saying here is that most of this, of course, is softwood, but there are real advantages of using hardwoods for CLT. So it would be great if we just even saw a very small proportion of this market switching over to hardwoods would create quite significant new opportunities for hardwoods. And AHEC has been doing a lot of work recently to test and to develop the hardwood CLT products. It's shown through structural tests that tulip wood CLT has very high strength to weight ratio. It offers particularly, again, there's a real opportunity to develop a niche market for hardwood CLT in Europe. I've got about a minute left, I think, so I'll just quickly move on to the final slide. The main take-home messages that I just want to emphasize in the last couple of slides is that there was the issue that we have in the hardwood sector. There are a lot of problems in the international hardwood trade and industry. One of the is highlighted from these slides. There's been no increase in the value of global hardwood trade in the last 15 years, and this is despite the huge growth in the emerging markets, and despite what we often see as the very significant natural advantages of using hardwood. It's a green product. It has considerable technical advantages compared with other materials. And we are having to look at how to overcome some quite significant long-term structural obstacles. Particularly this very high focus on a limited number of species, particularly oak, and in the tropical world on teak and rosewood. There is this strong preference for logs in emerging markets, and this preference is only just beginning to change. We do have fragmentation. We hear about this all the time. Fragmentation at all levels. In the forest, a lot of the wood now comes from non-industrial, small private owners. The trade is quite fragmented, and also in the end user sector. There's a lot of the wood is going into relatively small companies, furniture manufacturers, small joinery firms. A lot of fragmentation at all levels. And we also, this again is something I see a lot of in the tropical timber industry. There is this huge lack of investment still in active forest management, lack of investment in efficient processing. The time horizons are quite often quite limited in the hardwood sector internationally. There's this problem of it's not seen as a sexy industry. This inability to attract the best personnel is still a big problem. And there is this problem of regulatory capture. A lot of the markets in Europe, for example, are now very much restricted because the hardwood doesn't meet particular standards of certification, the FSC standard, for example. This has created quite a lot of obstacles in certain markets for hardwoods. But there are, at the same time, a lot of opportunities. It's worth highlighting those here. This large and expanding demand for all materials in emerging markets is very, very significant. China is, of course, despite it being a lot of challenges in selling into that market, it is a tremendous opportunity. The challenge now, of course, is to add value to the products which are sold there, to move away as far as possible from logs to more value-added products. And we can have a discussion perhaps about how we can achieve that transformation in the future. There is economic growth in Western markets, particularly in the United States. Even Europe now is beginning to take off. This will create new opportunities for hardwoods in the medium term. And there is this quite significant interest. This is something we come across all the time in Europe. It's quite clear that architects, designers, engineers are now becoming much more interested in using wood as a material. And this is not only, a lot of the initial interest was because of wood's sustainability credentials, but more recently there is this growing recognition again of the huge technical advantages of using wood, particularly, for example, to increase the speed of building, to reduce the impact of buildings, construction sites on the local environment. There is now, a lot of this is linked to the move towards prefabrication, increased use of engineering wood products. This is all creating new opportunities. I think I better stop there because I'm running out of time, but thank you very much for your attention. Thank you very much. Yeah.